Now that you have a better handle on which type of camera you'd like to be using for food photography, let's actually pick it up and start taking some really beautiful, well-composed shots. So here we're going to talk about framing your shots, how to get the right elements into the frame, how to use the rule of thirds to make your shots look more appealing. We're also going to talk about controlling your composition in terms of which elements you want to be in focus, which elements you want to be in the foreground and the background, and how to get the right angles to make your shots look beautiful. We'll discuss shooting in portrait versus landscape mode and why you may often want to shoot in portrait more than landscape. And finally, we'll talk about what to do with ugly food. If, despite your best efforts, the food you cook doesn't come out very pretty and you need to take pictures of it, there's some techniques you can use that have saved my life on so many occasions, so we'll take a look at those as well. Now, composition is basically just what's in the frame. It's what elements are included in the picture, whether they're in the foreground, or the background, or wherever they are. It's just how the rectangle is composed. And this includes two key elements. It includes the zoom level, because a tight shot is going to have less in the composition than a wide shot. A wide shot could include the entire table, for example, where a tight shot could be a close-up, and you're not going to have as much in your shot. The second aspect is the angle. The composition is going to change if you take a shot that's on the level of the table, so you're looking directly at the item, whether it's directly overhead, or whether it's a more natural angle, which would be the type of shot where you're actually looking down at the food at the same angle you would look at it if you were about to eat it. There is no such thing as the right angle, just different angles that work better for different types of setups. So while you could use any angle you want, there's three that typically work best for food photography, and let's take a look at those here. The first is the flat, table-level shot, where your camera could literally be resting on the table, taking a very direct shot of the food. The second, in the middle here, is the overhead shot. That's where you're taking a shot directly overhead, looking down. The final shot is a more natural shot, and this is the one I use most often, and I call it natural and put it in quotes because if you are sitting at a table ready to eat this ice cream, this is the angle you would be looking at it from, and this is the one I use most often. So there's been many examples throughout this course where we've seen each of these angles, and no one is more right than another, but you should be mindful of which angle you're shooting from and how that's going to affect your scene. Moving past the angle, the other key aspect is how tightly zoomed in you are. Now when I say zoom, I don't mean that aspect on your camera where it goes bzzz and it zooms in. What I'm talking about is just how close or far the camera is, whether you're actually using the zoom or whether you've just moved your camera closer. Either way, it's going to affect how much information is in your shot, and the two options here are either a tighter shot or a wider shot. So if you have a tighter shot, it's going to look more like this. You're going to have more focus on the food, if that's what you want, and there's going to be less background elements to focus on. Whereas if you have a wider shot, you're going to get a bigger story of what's going on in the picture. So again, there's no right or wrong way. It's just important to understand how zoomed in you are and why you're at that distance. A related aspect of composition is the depth of field. This is something we've talked about many times, and it is a really crucial aspect of food photography. Again, it determines how much of your scene is in focus and how much is blurry. So with these granola bars, you can see they're in focus fine, but the background is really blurry. And a shallow depth of field like this shot, where the background and foreground are blurry but the food is in focus, is generally best for food photography. It really highlights the focal point, in this case the granola bars, and makes that pop almost like it's in 3D, where the background just kind of fades away. And that's a really nice effect. It doesn't work all the time, but it does add a lot to certain pictures. If you don't have a DSLR where you can really finely control the depth of field, you can use overhead shots to negate this value. Because again, when you're doing an overhead shot, everything is at the same distance. So if I was looking at this picture from the top, the jam and the other granola bars and the granola bars in the front would all be the same distance from the camera because it's a vertical distance, the camera's above them. And that would negate the value of depth of field. So if you have a cheaper camera, it's better to use overhead shots more often. Now, no lecture on framing your shots would be complete without a discussion of the rule of thirds. Now, the rule of thirds basically says that your image is divided into thirds by dividing lines, vertically and horizontally. So you see there's thirds horizontally, there's 3 columns, and there's 3 rows. The goal, according to the rule of thirds, is to place the main focus point along one of these lines or along one of the intersecting points. So you see there's 4 points in the middle, around that middle square. You would put your focus on one of those points, or along one of the 2 horizontal lines, or one of the 2 vertical lines. And the idea is that using these lines results in a more balanced and well-composed picture. If that's actually true or not is really up to you. And being somewhat of a rebel myself, I tend to ignore this idea altogether for most of my shots. But here's one example of a picture that's really well composed according to the rule of thirds. You can see that this superfood ball is aligned along the bottom third horizontal line, and even more specifically, the point that's most in focus is along the bottom right intersecting point there. So again, I don't really use this all that much, but if you're having trouble getting well-composed shots, it can be useful to keep this in the back of your mind and think about setting up your shot along one of the horizontal or vertical lines. When you pick up your camera, you have basically 2 options. You can hold it horizontally, which is how most of us are naturally taught to use our cameras, or you can flip it on its side and shoot that way. Obviously, the picture is going to be the same in terms of the camera. It's the same size rectangle, but whether you're framing your shots horizontally or vertically, or in other words, in landscape versus portrait, can make a big difference. For example, if you're shooting something really wide, like, I don't know, shish kebabs on a barbecue, you would want to do landscape so you can get the whole skewer in the scene. Whereas if you're shooting a tall glass, you'd probably want to do it in portrait so you can get the whole glass vertically in the scene. But with food photography, I often shoot vertically, and then if I need to, I'll crop it down more towards a square, but most of my shots, I would say over 80% of them, are done in a vertical format. And the reason for this has everything to do with social media. For whatever reason, sites like Pinterest and Google Plus give a premium to shots that are vertically aligned. It's just the way their websites are designed. If your shots are in portrait mode, you get more real estate on their homepage and on your profile pages, and that's just the way it works. And let me show you what I mean. So these websites compress your images down to a certain width. Now this width is automatically set so that their website looks good in vertical columns. So while they compress the width, they don't compress the height. If you shoot your picture and they decide it's going to be this wide, like this landscape picture, you could shoot the same picture in portrait mode. It's going to be that same width no matter what, but look what happens. You get a lot more space. Now if that doesn't completely make sense, let's look at a live example of Pinterest's homepage here. I just took this picture. So you look at that soup on the left, it's shot in landscape mode and it doesn't have very much real estate. But if you look at the thing next to it, the enchiladas to the right, that's shot more in a square format and it has a lot more real estate. But if you look at the one next to that, the gluten-free Thanksgiving recipes, that's shot in portrait and look at how much more space it has compared to the others. And more space means more people are going to look at it, and more people are going to see it, more people are going to pin it, and more people are going to share it. So, for that reason and that reason alone, I often shoot in vertical. It's not that it's artistically better at all, it just gives you more opportunities on the social web, and I do like the way it looks. It looks good on my blog, it looks good on Pinterest, so that's pretty much how I shoot these days. I'll shoot in portrait, and if I need to, I'll crop it down more towards a square. And this is not a rule at all. Sometimes I do shoot in landscape, but a lot of my pictures now are vertical. Sadly, I have no idea where I learned this from. It's something I picked up somewhere, and I wish I could find the person who taught me and give them a giant hug because it has saved my life on so many times. So what happens if you make some food and you ignored all the information on the styling section and you have ugly food? You need to take a picture of it, it tastes really good, you want to share it, but the food is just really ugly. If that's the case, what you can do is actually zoom in. It seems so paradoxical, but food items that look less than appealing look better when you get closer to them and capture the details rather than the whole thing. Like these blueberry financiers over here. I put them in a muffin pan and they just didn't come out very good. They're a little awkward, they're shaped kind of weird, and I didn't like them very much. So I used this advice, I broke one in half, and I captured the detail, and look at how much better that looks. It's the same thing, but all I did was break one in half and zoom in. Now this is completely counterintuitive, but keep this in the back of your mind, that if the food isn't looking very good, no matter what it is or how it's set up, zoom in a little bit, capture some of the details, and it'll look a lot better, I promise. What we just talked about in this lesson is kind of a lot of theory, okay? Now, this is going to do nothing for you unless you put it into practice. It's not going to make a whole lot of sense. So what I'd like you to do is download the cheat sheet for this section on getting the best shots. It'll have a listing of all the things we've talked about, the rule of thirds, the different angles, zoom levels, depth of field. And I would like you to set up a scene using your camera, whichever camera you've decided to use, and then you'll use that cheat sheet to help you compose and frame your shots in different ways that take into consideration all the things we've talked about. Because what I've said isn't going to stick unless you actually put it into practice and start learning how to compose more beautiful and well-structured pictures.